From heart disease and cancer to broken bones and the common cold, there are countless medical ailments and conditions affecting people that elicit the sympathies of others. On the other hand, some medical conditions, such as leprosy and HIV/AIDS, have in various periods of human history generated social stigma. However, such prejudices are localized to these ailments. A growing number of experts, leaders, organizations, and institutions are increasingly pointing to a far greater healthcare stigma: mental illness. Just as there is a vast array of medical conditions, so too is there a broad spectrum of mental health conditions. Studies show that mental illness is far more common an ailment than many would admit, according to a Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration (SAMHSA) study. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans suffers from some form of mental illness. Some of them must be hospitalized, as their respective conditions are so debilitating that they cannot function. Others, however, are able to live normal lives as long as they receive counseling and/or medication. Medical and psychological science has brought into the spotlight the prevalence of mental illness. Then again, the stigma that has long been attached to mental illness has also been slow to change. The main parties seeking to address this issue, legislatures, nonprofit organizations, and advocacy groups, also often operate on limited financial resources and human capital. This issue has given rise to a conversation among advocates, whether to expend resources to educate the public about mental illness or whether to invest in researching and treating such illness. Understanding the discussion Affordable Care Act, a 2010 law to reform the U.S. healthcare system. National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI, a nationwide nonprofit organization dedicated to awareness about mental illness. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a multi-symptom mental illness commonly rooted in a traumatic experience, such as war, natural disaster, or violent crime. Stigma, perceived disgrace or shame applied to an individual, activity, or condition. History. Throughout human history, people with mental illness have received a decidedly different form of care than patients with medical conditions. After all, injuries and physical diseases have visible symptoms, while symptoms associated with mental illness are typically behavioral in nature. For millennia, those with mental illness were perceived by society as suffering from some sort of crisis of the soul. They were stricken with madness by the gods or possessed by a demon. The treatment for such supernatural conditions was to persuade the entity to leave the body. For instance, archaeologists have uncovered 5,000-year-old bodies with holes bored into their skulls, a practice known as trepanation, ostensibly to allow invading spirits the ability to leave. Over centuries, various societies struggled with the notion of mental illness. Some, such as the ancient Greeks in the 4th century BCE, attempted both to understand and to treat the afflicted. During the Middle Ages, some hospitals for the mentally ill began to appear in Europe. This trend continued through the 17th century, but such hospitals were less treatment centers and more dungeon-like in nature. Furthermore, in a period in which religious fundamentalism rose, many with mental illness were often persecuted as witches. In 1841, American teacher Dorothea Dix visited a jail in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There, she witnessed a large population of mentally ill individuals mixed together with criminals and people with developmental disabilities. The conditions in which they were living were, in Dix's estimation, extremely unclean, cold, and unhealthy. Dix, who was told by the jailers that such conditions existed because the mentally ill do not feel heat or cold, was inspired to become a global mental health activist. Isolation of such patients, by the end of the 19th century, gave way to research and treatment. During the 20th century, psychotherapy and psychoanalysis became increasingly commonplace, thanks in large part to the works of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Asylums were dedicated to treating conditions such as schizophrenia and what is now known as bipolar disorder. However, the treatments such as electroshock therapy and lobotomies were often mental illness awareness and new research dangerous and even inhumane. In 1946, President Harry S. Truman signed into law the National Mental Health Act, which established a National Institute of Mental Health. This legislation helped usher in a new era of mental health treatment, including the construction of modern mental institutions and the development of drug therapies. In the latter 20th century, it became clear that institutionalization was not necessary for all patients with mental illness. Legislation passed during the 1960s brought patients into community-based treatment programs. In 1979, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI, was founded. NAMI became one of America's leading advocates for research and public awareness of mental health issues. In 1990, in honor of NAMI's advocacy, Congress officially named the first week of October Mental Illness Awareness Week. NAMI and other organizations have continued to call attention to the plight of the homeless and incarcerated, many of whom suffer from a variety of diagnosable and treatable illnesses. Mental illness awareness and research today. Awareness of mental illness is growing. Millions of Americans receive healthcare coverage for mental health and substance abuse treatment. NAMI is not alone in the effort to spread the word about mental illness, according to GuideStar.com, a database of nonprofit organizations. There are more than 15,000 Internal Revenue Service registered nonprofit organizations committed to mental health issues. There is also increased integration between mental health and other forms of medicine. Such integration leads to more effective research and treatment protocols. In many ways, the growth and awareness about mental illness and treatment options is positive, casting a light on the importance of connecting those with mental illness with counseling and medical assistance. At the same time, this trend is also underscoring the widespread shortcomings in treatment. There remains a social stigma attached to mental illness, one that contributes to high suicide rates and refusal to seek treatment. The treatments are sometimes sporadic and inconsistent, especially when dealing with complex issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and borderline personality disorder. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, $35 billion is lost annually because of medical bills and lost work hours resulting from suicide. Health experts in particular noticed a spike in the suicide rate among adolescents in the 21st century. The CDC reported that number doubled from 2007 to 2014, when the total number set a new all-time high. Exacerbating the issue are a number of high-profile incidents involving gun violence. Among these incidents were the infamous 2012 theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School attack in Newtown, Connecticut, and the 2015 gun attack at a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. In each of these incidents, the suspects were allegedly experiencing various forms of untreated mental illness. Despite the fact that studies show the vast majority of people with mental illness are nonviolent, such incidents have contributed to long-standing public negative perceptions about mental illness. Scientists continue to seek a better understanding the causes and implications of mental illness, as well as potential medical and social treatments. Likewise, politicians continue to struggle to pass legislation that addresses the problem. The highly partisan political climate of the 2010s saw considerable disagreement over what initiatives and programs the government should support on the subject of mental illness. However, a moment of accord was reached in December 2016 with the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 94-5. President Barack Obama agreed to sign the medical funding bill, touting its goals including substantial funding for mental health research and treatment. Proponents of the act suggested it would greatly enhance the availability of mental health care around the country. There are imperatives both to share with the public information about mental illness and to build upon existing research in order to find more effective forms of treatment. However, this broad set of issues has touched off a debate, particularly in a period of economic uncertainty and limited financial resources. There are also questions about the efficacy of public awareness campaigns in driving at-risk people to caregivers, as well as removing the social stigmas applied to mental illness. On the other side are questions about the existing healthcare system and its ability to treat the mentally ill in the modern economic environment. The evolutions of this issue in the U.S. healthcare system are inextricably linked.